Welcome to the Respect the Math podcast, brought to you by Reliable Tech Help. For all your IT needs, call Reliable Tech Help at 502-797-7399 or visit our website at reliabletech, that's TEKhelp.com. I'm your host, Digital David Snyder. Here at the Respect the Math podcast, we talk about everything from technology to business, science, popular culture, and more. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and podcast apps from Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, Pandora, iHeart, and others. If you like what you hear, please like it and or subscribe. Please interact with us. We'd love to hear from you. Today, our guest is the current chairman of the philosophy department at University of Louisville. His name is Professor Avery Kolers. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real honor to have you on here. A little background. I am an alumni of the University of Louisville, the philosophy department specifically, and every day I use that skill that some people might question the validity of in my relationships, my business dealings, just life in general. It taught me how to think critically and solve problems, exposed me to a lot of different worldviews and ways to view things. So I'm grateful for that every day. And it's a real honor and a privilege to have you on here. So introduce yourself to the audience and talk about your background, and let's go.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here.
So, thank you.
I really appreciate the invitation. So my name is Avery Kolers. I've been at U of L since 2000. I got here in the fall of 2000, and I am now in 2020, the first pandemic semester, I became chair of the department when the chair became the dean of arts and sciences. And so we've been through the last couple of years. We've been through some, financial uncertainty and uncertainty about whether students could stay in school, could finish, how we were going to teach our classes between online and in person. So it's been a I wouldn't say rough, but it's been an up and down and some high intensity couple years.
Hopefully it's unprecedented moving forward. Hopefully this will be the last bump in the road of this size you guys encounter, right?
Yeah. I mean, things that seemed like once in a century before seem to not be so infrequent anymore.
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah. But I came here from the University of Arizona, where I did my PhD in Tucson, and I'm originally Canadian from Toronto, Canada.
Well, we won't hold that against you.
Thanks. The Philadelphia 76ers fans, I think, will hold it against me, but everybody else maybe might not. So.
Raptors, yeah. Sixers kind of thing?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Did you follow basketball much? Or
no, the Raptors certainly only arrived after I'd left for college. So so I grew up with the Leafs and the Blue Jays, basically, and life and death.
Do you have dual citizenship? Or?
I do indeed.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. Make it back to Canada very often, or?
Up until the pandemic, it was at least once and sometimes twice a year. And my family comes down to visit at least once and sometimes twice a year. But then we had a long break during the pandemic. But I've been back now, twice, once for work and once for family since the pandemic.
Do you speak French?
I do, but it's a bit rusty, so I won't offend the ears of any francophones who are listening.
Yeah, so tell us about your academic background. Were you always a thinker, always challenging ideas and asking questions? And when did that start?
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, the reason I originally chose philosophy as a major, it was my second major, and I started out. I was a political science, international relations major, and I was studying peace and diplomacy in the Middle East was the thing I was focused on, and I wanted a second major because students want second majors, and I thought, well, the two hardest classes I'd taken my first couple years in college were philosophy and history. So I decided I had to conquer one of them. Yeah. And it was almost random that it was philosophy instead of history. And I never conquered it, unfortunately. So I'm still pushing the rock up the hill. Still conquering? Yeah. Something like that. It's still being conquered.
Yeah.
But then what happened was studying the kinds of arguments that get made in the diplomacy, politics sphere, especially, in the Middle East. That was the time, it was the 90s, the time of the Oslo negotiations and so on. It really struck me that I was interested more in the normative questions underlying the political positions than I was in the sort of the who had the upper hand right now questions, or how to gain the upper hand, what the strategies were to gain the upper hand. The game, right, right. And what's funny is I do some philosophy of games now, so but we can talk more about that. But it was they're talking about when they make claims against each other. They don't just say, I want this. They appeal to values. And if we could talk honestly about those values, then maybe we could make some progress. And so that made me think that was what I needed to study, was the underlying normative questions.
And what branch of philosophy would that fall under? Would that be ethics, or would that be logic, or some of both? Or
yeah, so if you consider sort of the universe of philosophy, people would put ethics under value theory, which includes ethics and aesthetics. So it's like how to understand value terms, and where in aesthetics it's where beauty is. Is it in the world? Is it merely in the eye of the beholder? Are we recognizing something and discerning something when we see aesthetic qualities? And then on the ethics side of value theory, it's like, where are moral values? Do they exist in the world? Why do they have authority over us? Is it something we can agree on universally, or is it something that we're stuck within a particular local culture? And then within ethics, you get branches, and social political philosophy is usually considered a branch of ethics, because we look at political arrangements and say, well, what gives a right to claim authority to that group over this territory or over these people? These people say that this is our property. They're making a claim on it. Well, what value does that claim have? That kind of thing. So those are still moral claims, but they have real political force.
And so our politics and our political policies that we advocate and put in place are a reflection of our values. To an extent.
Yeah, right. And so you'd hope, right? So there in many cases there are divergences between what we think is right and the policies we live under. Right. And a lot of that, like, there's problems of knowledge, problems of who's motivated more, and so on. You think of things like, I don't know, mass incarceration. I think most people, I don't have polling data. Most people think that something's wrong with our criminal justice system, but there's just a difficulty of getting, actions to follow values, right? So we have that problem, getting actions to follow values. But then there are also problems of having values that we haven't thought through. And so we might have, so for instance, going back to the criminal justice issue, some people might have very punitive worldviews and want our criminal justice institutions to be more punitive, whereas other people might have less punitive worldviews and want them to be less punitive. That's a value difference, and hopefully we can talk about those value differences and try to see what motivates us to believe one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And so the fascination isn't even so much with what you decide your value is, the process you use to decide it. What logic is underlying that, and how does that connect to policy and social issues and that kind of thing. Do you find being a philosopher, I'm assuming, are you tenured at the?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have a little freedom there to kind of pursue the things you want. That's kind of the idea of tenure.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of misinformation out there about that. A lot of people, particularly on the right politically, will say, well, these academics have a job for life and they can do whatever they want. Well, the other side of that is the tenure gives them the benefits and the income and the position, the stability they need to go off and to pursue their own academic their interests, right?
Right.
And we want that because look how much has come out of people relatively free to pursue what interests them, and ultimately you would hope the things that people are naturally interested in and want to pursue will yield the best benefits for them and ultimately for society, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel that you have the freedom to be a little more from an activist standpoint also in your department? Because I know there's sometimes, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, can determine the sensitivity or the tolerance for that. Can you talk about that?
Right. Yeah, sure. So tenure is a very specific kind of job security. So it's really, ultimately, it just turns you from an at-will employee to a with-cause employee. So you can still be fired if you have tenure. It's just that they have to show cause to fire you, unless they eliminate your whole department, in which case they can fire you in 10 days' notice, which is shocking. But at any rate, so what tenure does is it protects free inquiry, as you say. It doesn't protect you from like charges of sexual harassment or assault or whatever, right? Anything that an employee who can be fired with cause can be fired for, a tenured person can be fired for. So what tenure does is it protects academic freedom and freedom of inquiry, as you suggest, and that it has a few knock-on benefits. So one of them is the freedom to fail. So I've had research projects, like I feel like I have no complaints about my career. I've published and I'm happy and I want to keep publishing.
Yeah.
But there have been some major failures, things that I worked a long time on and didn't get anything out of it in terms of publications. Having tenure makes it possible for me to try something that's risky. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. It's a shame. I've learned a lot in the process. Now I'm going to have to move on because this isn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
But I can. So that kind of freedom to fail is really important, especially in a creative or research-based field where the nature of the beast is you set out on a project not knowing whether it's going to bear fruit, right? So think of all the people who immediately started studying infectious diseases in spring of 2020, right? We've heard about a few of the real great breakthroughs, but if you look at that spring of 2020, there must have been 50 or 100 universities that had initial agreements to market some agent that U of L was one of them, some agent that they thought would be the
like a treatment for COVID, or
either a treatment or a vaccine, right?
Okay.
And so U of L got a marketing agreement with a company to start developing this. I think it was a vaccine of a type that's worked for some cancers that was developed at U of L. It didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? How can you know it's going to succeed when you start? You can't, right? It's not like a job where you know exactly what the outcome is and you know exactly how to produce it.
Yeah.
And so that freedom to fail, tenure is crucial for buying people that freedom to fail. And then the second is that freedom of inquiry and freedom of or academic freedom to teach where you think the field requires you to teach. So I can give the example of laws that it didn't in the end pass, but there was a law in the Kentucky legislature that would have extended a so-called critical race theory ban to teaching in higher education. And so what that prevents is if somebody thinks that there's an important analysis of the way the legal system works. So critical race theory, in a very small nutshell, is this view that the prime driver of continued worse outcomes, particularly for African Americans in the United States, but for other people of color as well, is not the individual meanness or discrimination or racism of particular people, but it's baked into our institutions in important ways. And so then critical race theory, or people developing that line of thought, will then study those institutions and ask, well, how is race baked into this in a way that doesn't seem obvious, right? So, so if I think, as I do, if I think that is an important insight about some of our institutions, then I need to be able to first pursue that without fear of retaliation, and then teach it if it's true, right? Or if there's good reason to think that it's true, so that if I'm teaching, like there are 2 or 3 different theories about why racial stratification persists, let's say, I need to be able to teach that as one of the theories because it's a going possibility that that's right. And so that's what tenure achieves, that the freedom to inquire and the freedom to teach about where the state of inquiry is.
And there's parallels there too to living in a free society, right? People should be free with certain restrictions. You can't go yell fire in a crowded theater or threaten someone's life. But, in a democracy, a free society, people should be free to pursue the things that make them happy and that they're curious about.
Right.
I find myself on the political spectrum really confused for most people because social issues, I'm moderate liberal to liberal on those. But then as an entrepreneur and a guy who's built 4 businesses and had some success, I look at the fiscal part of it, and I'm more conservative. You mentioned the freedom to fail. There's plenty of reasons to not like big pharma, right? Charging this or that for this life-saving treatment. But what people don't talk about is the countless research that they do, the countless experiments that they do that all fail, that they invest millions and billions of dollars into, right. And they might get 1 out of 100 that actually passes the testing process, then gets FDA approval, and then gets into the marketplace to make some money. If you want that on the back end, you've got to give them the freedom and the incentive on the front end to develop and ask questions and be curious, right? And so that, it just doesn't apply to an academic setting. It applies to a civil setting for anybody, a business or an individual in a free market. I wanted to mention the Supreme Court ruling recently. Are you comfortable in talking about that?
Yeah, I have tenure. I'm comfortable talking about anything.
Perfect. The reason I mention that is the first thing is I think the world would be a lot better place if we were all just a little more curious about each other. You and I might disagree on this or that political issue, and we might have an interesting, heated discussion about it, but I'm never going to insult you or say you're a bad person because you disagree with me. I think it was Walt Whitman, said, be less judgmental and be more curious. I just wish people were more curious. And so I've been told from a very young age, you don't talk about religion and politics. And I've always said, well, those are the things I'm most interested in, right? What type of a conversation are you going to have if it doesn't include at least some of those things, right? So I wanted to bring up the abortion thing. I consider myself to be an old school feminist. And that is derived from my underlying philosophy, basically that humans have certain rights that we should cherish: the freedom of expression, speech, freedom to practice any religion or no religion that you want, basic dignity of, economic opportunity, access to health care, things like that, protection from being, murdered or having your property stolen, that kind of things, basic things. And so when I say old school feminism, I don't mean neo-feminism. I mean people like Christina Hoff Sommers, who was kind of ran out of academia because she wrote a book saying that boys have certain traits and girls have certain traits and they're different. I kind of got off on a tangent there, but I want to bring up this issue. As a person who's a firm believer in fundamental human rights, therefore I'm an old school feminist, we've fought for centuries in this country to get women on a level playing field. And I am very sympathetic personally to the pro-life movement. I think that there's a strong argument that can be made that there's a life there and that life has value and we should protect it. However, the mother is a life too, right? And she has certain rights. And I think that even if Roe versus Wade is overturned and then there's the Casey decision, I'm worried about that. I think it's going to set back women's rights quite far back, but that also impacts us. It just doesn't impact women. A threat to their rights and their freedoms and their protections is a threat to ours, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I share your view that the right to control one's bodily autonomy is about the most basic fundamental right there is. If there's no sort of sovereignty over everything inside the skin, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then there's nothing. And so, I guess I think it sounds like we have a similar view on what the court should decide, or if the court makes the decision it looks like it may well make, mm-hmm. then how legislatures should respond. But I guess what's strange about abortion politics is that, and this is kind of implied by what you're saying, so much is made to ride on the question of whether a fetus is a life. Mm-hmm. And I think that is such an that's so obviously not the right question. Because of course fetuses are alive, right? There's a difference between a living fetus and a dead fetus, right? Mm-hmm. It's often tragic and horrible when there's a stillbirth or a fetus dies in utero. Mm-hmm. So clearly it's alive. That's just not the relevant question when it comes to abortion. The relevant question is, does this person have autonomy over their body?
And I think another layer to that is, shouldn't a human being have the right to go to their doctor and have a private conversation and consultation about their health, right? I mean, we hold sacred the notion of doctor-patient confidentiality. Right. This would violate that. I mean, is there every OBGYN clinic going to be monitored by some abortion enforcer? I mean, it just doesn't. For so many reasons, it deeply impacted me when I heard that came out a couple of days ago. And I think it's important for people to realize if it affects a category of people that you're not in, that affects you too.
Right.
We're going to talk about that in a few minutes with free speech. I wanted to bring up I think I have a clever solution to the abortion issue as a whole. Would you like to hear it?
Go for it.
Like you said, it's a false flag to argue over whether that's a life or not, right? That's not the point of the argument, but so many people are hung up on that, right? For me, if I needed a replacement ear right now, some doctor somewhere could swab the DNA in my mouth and grow me a replacement ear in a petri dish, right? You're telling me we don't have the medicinal technology and the know-how to extract a child from someone who doesn't want it and bring it to term artificially, or even maybe do an implant into the womb of someone trying to have a child. You never hear people on the political extremes on both sides of that bring anything like that up. That would resolve the ethical concerns that the right has, and it would resolve the obvious concerns the left has of forcing someone to have a child they don't want to have. I think it's also important to mention too that there are cases, they're obviously outliers and unusual, where giving birth will kill the mother.
Right.
Should that be a death sentence? Rape, incest, all those kinds of things. I just think there's so many obvious exceptions where we have to preserve that right in a society that claims, right, purports to value choice and freedom and all the medical confidentiality and access to medical care and all that too.
Right.
What do you think about that? Do you think there's any interest, or has it become a hot button political football that's going to kick back and forth until the end of time? Do you see any coming together trying to find a solution that meets both concerns?
Thinking back to the 1990s was when Bill Clinton tried to articulate this vision of he called it safe, legal, and rare, right? And you'd think that if safe, legal, and rare, or even rare, was your goal, then you wouldn't actually be take up the sort of the pro-life position as articulated by somebody like Samuel Alito. The reason I say that is if you look at this development in public health called harm reduction, this harm reduction is most evident, for instance, in needle exchanges, where people are going to use opioids anyway, right? If they can't get it in a clean needle, they'll get it in a contaminated needle. So if
any way they can,
right, exactly. And so if you provide clean needles, you save lives, right? You stop HIV outbreaks in particular. If you provide, in fact, heroin assisted or medically assisted treatment, you can treat some people who can't be treated otherwise, for instance, with cold turkey stopping or something like that.
Are we talking about methadone, that kind of stuff?
Sure, right.
Okay,
yeah. And there are other versions of sort of opioids or heroin derivatives that are similarly used. And when people use those, they're actually administering the drug to people who are addicted to the drug. And it saves lives. It's in a supervised clinic setting, clean needles, graduatedly lesser doses, and it helps some people get off when they couldn't get off otherwise. So that's the harm reduction approach. You stop judging people and telling them just stop, just say no. Yeah. And instead you say, well, how can we make it the case that this doesn't kill you, right? Yeah. So that's the harm reduction approach to opioids. There's a harm reduction approach to abortion, and the harm reduction approach to abortion is effective, high quality sex ed, starting from age appropriate sex ed, starting from elementary school,
pre-puberty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then wide availability of contraception and wide availability of abortion. So if abortion is widely available as part of a process of understanding that people are going to do this anyway, right? Sex happens. People are going to get pregnant when they don't want the baby. People are going to have dangerous pregnancies. Crimes like incest and rape are going to happen and will sometimes yield pregnancies. If you recognize that these things are the case and take a harm reduction approach, you get safe, legal, and rare. And a politics focused on extirpation, banning, is a politics that causes the number of abortions to go up. It just makes them less safe. And I fear, I had the same dread when I saw the draft opinion. I fear that that's where we're headed.
Yeah, it's going to happen one way or another. Why not step in and try to regulate it to an extent and minimize the damage done.
Yeah.
Yeah. For a lighthearted segue here, George Carlin, one of my heroes, once said that when we have a problem in this country, we declare war on it. We have the war on drugs, the war on homelessness, the war on crime. We never really do anything about it. We just declare war on it, right? When you mentioned the less harm approach to public policy, it made me think about that. You know, what are we really doing?
Right.
One thing I wanted to mention was the free speech aspect of human rights. I think we talked about this before in a previous conversation. If we didn't, forgive me. I thought it was fascinating when I found out that the ACLU, I think back in the 50s in New York City, made their name by defending the free speech rights of Ku Klux Klan members and neo-Nazis. The integrity involved in defending that disgusting speech, I don't even want to call it speech, it's hate-filled, vile, disgusting speech, but these people had the integrity and the respect for the underlying issue that's more important of free speech to protect those people and basically ensure that they would be able to go out there and do all that stuff. That's mind-blowing to me. Can you comment on what they did, how important free speech is? I'm sure it's a common theme in your work in the department.
Yeah, so there's an important but difficult line that has to be drawn between because it's possible to commit violence with speech, right? So a credible threat of violence is actionable, right? And so that's one reason that people argue for hate speech codes and so on, right? So if somebody is subjected to threats by, let's say, by people who are carrying guns, right? And they come up and they start threatening a person and attacking them on the basis of their race, or it doesn't even have to be hate speech, let's say. If somebody who makes a credible threat of violence against you, all they've done is they've spoken, but still it's assault, right? Because the credible threat is an attack, is verbal violence. And so it's a hugely important line to draw between speech that offends and even speech that up to the line that traumatizes, right? So the case that you're describing is, if I know exactly what you're referring to, was in Skokie, Illinois, which was a heavily Jewish suburb of Chicago. Was a heavily Jewish suburb of Chicago? I don't know what the demographics are now. There were a lot of Holocaust survivors living there, and the neo-Nazis were going to parade through Skokie, right? And so this was it speech? Well, it's, as you say, it's like placards, Nazis, slogans, and signs look like speech,
expression,
right? Yeah, that's right. Was it likely to traumatize? Yes. Is speech that traumatizes on the hate speech / verbal assault side of speech, or is it on the speech side of speech? And the ACLU draws that line pretty far over, and there's a lot to be said for drawing the line pretty far over.
So they're pushing the boundary of leaning more towards it might be traumatic and offensive as opposed to the other side where don't let them say anything, right? Because it might hurt someone's feelings.
Well, that's right. So if you push it, I'm sorry. Yes, exactly. If you didn't, their view is if you didn't push it that way, you'd push it the other way, and,
right? And
speech that merely offends is going to be made illegal. And I think a really important aspect of the ACLU, going back to its founding, I guess over 100 years ago now, is I just lost my train of thought thinking of whether they're 100 years ago. Sorry.
It's okay. They're pushing the boundary of what's offensive and what's traumatic versus what's violence.
Yes, and one important reason for doing so is the argument that it might be nice to stop Nazis from speaking, but in the long run, it's not only going to be Nazis that get stopped from speaking. As soon as you give the government this power to stop people from offending, well, who's going to have this deployed against them, right? And you see right now with Blue Lives Matter and Back the Blue kinds of things. Well, who is it that now has the power to say you don't get to say, right? You don't want the police to be able to say, nobody gets to criticize the police because it offends us, right? So these kinds of things don't tend to stay with the people who want them in the time of an emergency. So,
I heard that articulated by a free speech expert. I forget his name, but he said history has taught us over and over again the last group of people you want it to empower with the ability to determine what is acceptable speech and what isn't is the government, the ruling class. And he said, you know, right now Biden's in office and it's a Democrat House and Senate and that kind of thing. You might like those folks. You know, they might have your values and your politics, right? You give them the power to do that. You're also giving the subsequent administration to do it. And you're probably not going to like, you know, maybe not the next 4 years, but 4 years after that, eventually we know there's going to be Republicans and conservatives in there. You're also giving them the ability to do that too. And they might start knocking on your door and telling you that your speech is unacceptable and you're not going to like that.
Right.
So I thought that was a really good way to articulate that.
Yeah.
I think it's a knee-jerk reaction in our society. Well, I don't like what Trump said, so he should be taken off of Twitter. I'm not a Trump fan. Anybody that knows me knows that. I don't care for the guy for a lot of reasons. However, he didn't incite violence. Maybe the January 6th thing. Okay, maybe, right. I personally believe at best he indirectly incited that, and at worst he caused it. I mean, that's reasonable, right? We can argue about that, and that's fine. But the man, in my opinion, should not have been taken off of Twitter if, and this is a big if, Twitter is interpreted as the modern, what do they call it? Not the marketplace, but the forum, the public forum, right?
Yeah, the public square.
Yeah, the public square. And there's an argument that it is the modern digital incarnation of the public square, right? Another layer to that is that it's also a private company with stockholders who own it. And we believe in private property in this society, right?
Yeah.
So do they have the right to determine what the rules of the road, so to speak, when using their platform to express yourself? So they're all interesting questions. And go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
yeah.
Please chime in.
Yeah. I mean, so this has been an issue since there was a free speech case in a shopping mall, maybe back in the 80s, where I believe that it might have been a restricted case, but a court found that a shopping mall couldn't evict people for expressing political opinions, because the shopping mall had become the public square. Oh,
they argued that in one on that basis?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so there is a case to be made that anything that becomes the public square has an accentuated duty to ensure that people are free to speak.
Interesting.
Now, there are two problems with this. Mm-hmm. One is that just to the extent that something becomes the public square, the public then has a very strong stake in having a say about what it's like, right? And so the idea of the public square being owned privately is a problem. And I think the person who said you don't want the government to have the power to determine what you can say, right? You also don't want people who own, the private property owners who own the public square to have a right over what you can say. And so we've seen this in Louisville and 4th Street Live.
Yeah.
Private, and they can evict people who aren't dressed right.
Right.
And so what happens to the public square? So that's an important sort of caveat there. And then second, the public square, there need to be traffic rules for the public square, and some of those traffic rules have to do with speech. Mm-hmm. So if somebody says something and then there's a massive pylon, on Twitter, say women who are on Twitter get threats of rape, threats of killing, much more than men do.
Stalking, violence, harassment.
Exactly.
You name it, yeah.
Right. And so those are all speech acts. Those threats of violence, doxing, those are all speech acts. And
misuses of free speech.
That's right. Yeah. And so the square can be a public square with free speech only if there are certain kinds of speech that aren't able to gain a toehold. Mm-hmm. And so it's extremely complex. I just don't think it's important not to sort of fall on the side of, like when Elon Musk bought Twitter, he said he's going to make it completely open, right? And first of all, I think that's impossible, because that involves, every ad, every troll, everything has complete access to you. Mm-hmm. Every threat of violence or rape or whatever has complete access. And if that happens, then there are lots of people who can't speak, who will be shouted down every time. And so it ceases to be about free speech altogether.
What's your personal opinion on that? You think Trump should have been banned from Twitter? Do they have the right to do that? Not everything you have the right to do, you ought to do. I'm sure this is a common theme in your classroom for some of your ethics and other courses. Can you talk about that? Should he have been removed? And yay or nay, answer that. And then after we answer that, does Twitter have the right to do that? Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So the punishment of world leaders, and even after he ceased to be president, I think there's a sense in which Trump is in this category, the punishment of world leaders has a certain value, even over and above sort of the mere question of the punishment of a particular person. So if there's a private person with however many million followers, and he's a real jerk on Twitter, and even if he incites violence, there's a better reason for not interfering, not banning for a private person. And unfortunately, our international criminal institutions, our International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice, they're not set up well for this. Mm-hmm. But world leaders, or people who are in positions of power and authority that aren't just private, I think that their actions have consequences is more important, because it establishes the culture of the whole in a way that like a currently high profile private person doesn't, I think.
So you're describing that distinction between a public personality versus a private person, but what about what ought to happen? Should they be held to a higher standard? Is that fair? I mean, they're a citizen in a free society, a democracy.
Yeah.
Is it fair to, hand that to them, or to impose that label or that restriction on them? Or you're just kind of answering the more descriptive, view of it?
I mean, he volunteered for public office. Nobody forced him to run for president, Mm-hmm. And his presidency was an exercise in demeaning the office.
It seemed like it, yeah.
and maybe there's something to be said for the whole idea. Like, I remember back when George Bush was starting the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. Anytime you would criticize the Iraq War,
you're
the response would be, not just that you're anti-American, but that you should have respect for the office. And my thought was, like, this guy just launched an invasion without cause. Right. Why should I respect anything he does, right?
Right.
And so similar, like, I think there's something to be said for, respect the office isn't a very good general rule. Mm-hmm. But that somebody in that position understands himself to be under a duty of decorum and respect for others, and knows that his words carry great weight. That's really important, and isn't using the weight of his words for private vendettas or public vendettas, such as
personal gain for your own businesses, or
right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. In that sense, part of the question about whether Twitter should ban a person isn't necessarily the question of whether he deserves to be banned in some mm-hmm. deontological sense. Mm-hmm. There's something to be said for the consequentialist reasoning that says, well, if it's going to make him less able to pursue personal vendettas by getting his supporters to dogpile people, or if it's gonna, well then maybe so, Mm-hmm. If it's going to improve the overall quality of the public square so that people can talk better, mm-hmm. maybe so. I'm not sure it's done those things. I'm in philosophy, not in IT public management like Elon Musk is. So I don't know, but I think there's a good case that the banning him was the right thing to do, and especially after January 6th when he...
It was kind of the cherry on top of the whole thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the culmination of all the hate speech and
right.
the, volatile language and polarizing language. And, one thing that is interesting with Trump are the optics of things. I find myself, I figured this out a couple of years ago, and it really kind of changed the way I look at things, and particularly politicians and politics. You can support an idea, but when you do that, you need to step back from that and see, what does that look like on the outside, the optics approach, right? And so there were a few ideas that he had. I don't hate everything the man stands for. I think he did some decent things for the economy, and he helped fast track the vaccines and stuff like that. But when you look at an issue where he was big on, like, the border, you know what I'm saying? I believe he has a fair case when he says that a country has borders and an ability to control those borders. And if it doesn't, by definition, it's not a country. I don't think that's so radical. But when you start deporting all these people and demonizing all these people who, let's face it, are just coming here for the opportunity to scrub toilets and make money, right? I mean, that's the majority of them, right? And when you demonize these people and you associate yourself with that issue, what are the optics of that? who is disproportionately impacted by a policy like that? And it's not just that. Abortion, free speech issues, welfare, lots of public issues, public policy decisions. They almost, if they're bad, they almost disproportionately impact minorities, LGBTQ, the poor, children, right?
Right.
When it comes to public policy and politics, I'm very liberal when it comes to children, and I'll tell you why. A, they didn't ask to come here. B, most of them don't have a voice to speak up for themselves. And C, I think there's enough resources in this country where every child should have fundamental basic access to health care, a decent education, food, a place to live, that kind of thing. Can you talk about the optics versus, clinging to this kind of dogmatic, well, it has to be this way, I don't care what it looks like, versus the more subtlety and nuanced approach of examining the optics of things?
Right. That's a great question. And, it's one of those things that being in philosophy sort of doesn't help, because in philosophy, you're often so focused on the principle that's being asserted that there's a risk of abstracting from the reality, or abstracting from the sort of the empirical world in which the principle would have to be applied, and then and looking only at the principle, and the result is that you can do some damage because you're not thinking about how it's going to work in the world. And so the optics is a big part of it, but I think that what you're describing isn't just optics, it's what the real impact on people's lives is. And I think immigration is a great one, right? So we have these debates that really they're affecting huge numbers of people, and
vulnerable people who have no representation.
Yeah, and the idea of trying to assert a principle against them, right? They should have come in legally, right? Well, maybe so, but the legal immigration system is broken, and so maybe they should have come in legally, but maybe there should have been a way of coming in legally, right? Things like that. It strikes me that resting or standing on the principle is can do grave wrong to people.
Exclusively.
Yeah, that's right. So Aristotle has this principle that he calls being an equitable person, and I find this really valuable ideal. And what an equitable person does, according to Aristotle, is not stand on his rights even when the law is on his side. And so Aristotle's thinking about people who are in a position of privilege. Right? So his audience are Athenian citizens who are propertied males who don't have to work for a living. So, but a lot of philosophers who read Aristotle now think that what he says about propertied males is what we should apply to everybody, because the status of propertied males was those who had full citizenship and shared in the government of their society, and that's what we all aspire that all of us should have. And so when he says somebody who, as an equitable person, takes a little bit less than what he had a full right to, so it doesn't stand on his rights when somebody else is. So something really important for somebody else is hanging in the balance, right? And I think that's clearly the case with undocumented folks here, or people who overstayed their visas, are working bad jobs. The badness of their jobs is exacerbated by the fact that their employers know that they have no rights and no recourse. They can't join unions. Those are extremely vulnerable people.
No OSHA protection,
right?
No legal. Really standing, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And constant fear that they're going to be found and deported, and indeed
that's exploited.
Exactly, that's exploited. Immigration raids can be done as a punishment for speaking up on the job. So
yeah, you mentioned the power and the influence that the privileged class has over the non-privileged. Reminded me of one of my favorite George Carlin quotes. He said, "The longer you live in this country, the more you realize that America's number one product is the creation, manufacture, marketing, and distribution of bullshit." And if you want proof, here it is. The country was founded by a group of white male slave owners who told us that all men are created equal.
That's right.
And that's a little oversimplified, I'm sure, for comedy purposes, but there's some truth there, right? I mean, to stand up there and proclaim that all human beings are created equal.
Right.
Oh, by the way, my slave is serving us our meal now,
right,
against their will. I think there's some truth there, right? I think that needs to be said. One theme that's come up in the various topics we've discussed today, and I think it's important, particularly when you're advocating for the role of academia, general philosophy specifically, it's okay to have a conversation and not arrive at some clear-cut answer, right?
Yeah.
Side A has this argument, and they think it's that way, and that's interesting, and it has its own merits, and side B has the same. I'm sure you run into a lot of that in your classrooms, your discussions with your colleagues and students.
Right.
I think so much, particularly in our Western modern culture, is hammer it out and come up with an answer.
Right.
Things are not very binary in that way, right? Most things, if you think about them with an open mind and you're sourcing different perspectives on it and considering those sincerely, there's not always an answer, and I think that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, the philosopher John Rawls, who was one of the main political philosophers of the last century, really, he calls this the burdens of judgment. If two people start from a position of agreement about major issues, the more they think, the more they learn, the more they talk, they're actually likely to diverge rather than converge. So it's
interesting.
So it's not like math,
yeah,
right? Where if 3 6th graders get 3 different answers, if they work together and the teacher probably helps, they're going to get to the single correct answer.
Yeah.
Whereas with issues, social issues, philosophical issues, moral issues, political issues, we don't expect convergence.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I see this in class. I mean, I just finished teaching my ethics class this semester. And, in ethics, what you do is you teach a bunch of different theories, and you sort of teach them all as attempts to answer a set of questions, like how should I live? And then you have a bunch of different theories that tell you different ways. I mean, there's a lot of convergence, don't get me wrong, on the obvious things, but there are differences in sort of the fundamental commitments of those theories and then in certain implications of them. And then at the end, you have to go back and say, okay, the mere fact that there are all these different theories, like, you weren't expecting, or you don't get to expect that I'm going to tell you now on the last day of class which one of them is correct, right?
Yeah.
That's just not how it works.
Yeah.
Why doesn't it work that way? Is it because relativism is true and it's just whatever you want? And the answer is no, it's not because relativism is true and it's just whatever you want. It's you have to go through the commitments and the arguments for each one, and go with the one that you think is closest to the truth, or revise it in a way that makes it better. But the truth, and what ultimately the test of rightness is, if you can live with it, right? Sort of fundamentally,
pragmatic.
Yeah, in the end, it's got to be that you're always answerable to that, to logic, truth, and the final test of if you can live with it, right? If it calls on you to do unaccountable harm to people, it's probably wrong. So let's try to figure out, right? You're still accountable to that, so you don't get to just sort of plump for whatever you feel like.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of a pass just to do whatever you want.
Yeah. But still you can't expect that we're going to converge either. Right. And so that means that good people who are rational, they're being
open-minded,
conscientious,
dialogue back and
open-minded,
forth. Yeah.
they're still likely to diverge. And that's what allows conversation to continue. Right.
Yeah, I've heard someone once describe the truth as like a wet bar of soap. So, you ever heard that? The harder you try to grab it, the slippier it gets. right. I also remember I took I think it was an anthropology class in my undergraduate studies at U of L, and the professor kept basically saying, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, that cultures decide what's right and wrong. And that always bothered me back then,
Yes.
But also back then, I was pretty arrogant compared to where I am now. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I was raised Christian, and so I kind of believed, kind of didn't. But that idea of an absolute right and wrong, universality, objectivity, really, it took me a long time to shake that idea. And I look back on it now, and I'm like, yeah, cultures kind of do decide what's right and wrong, right? I
need you to unlearn that.
Yeah, for a multitude of reasons. One thing that really changed my outlook on that was about 10 years ago when I got on this physics kick. And I don't know how much you know about quantum mechanics.
Not very much.
I'll do a brief little summary here. So Newton and Einstein gave us practically everything we need to know to navigate the familiar everyday world, where if I roll this pin across the table, I can conclude that if it ended up there, it passed through every point in between and started here, right? Predictability, certainty, right? Everything's logical. Well, around the early 1900s, physicists started probing the structure of the atom and understanding the way that subatomic particles behave, electrons, protons, neutrons, and all the deeper, more fundamental particles that make those up, and it doesn't work that way. An electron can go from here to here and not pass through any space in between. It can also be here and here at the same time. It can do all these bizarre behaviors. And so the concept there was called locality. Locality, local, right? So if something happens here, by virtue of the fact it's happening here, it can't be happening there. Simple, intuitive, everyday concept, works great. In fact, Newton's laws of gravitation and motion gave us enough to land a man on the moon 200 and something years later, right? Pretty good. But when you magnify things and you get down to that quantum level where it's subatomic particles, things don't work that way. And I resisted that for probably 7 or 8 years. And there's still this, I haven't totally given into it, but there's still this internal, that's not the world I see. It's not intuitive that way. But by reading and listening to podcasts and exposing myself to more and more quantum physics and listening to physicists, I've come around to that idea, and it's really opened my mind to a whole new world of possibilities. I would think there's some parallels there with philosophy. You've kind of got this surface that's accessible, and it's intuitive, and it makes sense, and you can get to it, and it's not hard to maneuver your way through it and navigate it. But underneath, there's this whole world that we don't understand. I just think that's fascinating to think about. Can you comment on that at all? How the parallels in philosophy and if you don't have anything to say, that's fine too.
Yeah. No. Just one thing, and I don't know very much about quantum physics, but what's interesting is that the way to determine whether the world really is as quantum physics says, it's ultimately going to be answerable to tests that can be done in the empirical reality that we know, right? And so there's a kind of paradox there, sort of fundamentally. I'm not saying it's not true. Paradoxes are not necessarily not true. They're just right. Philosophy is kind of like that as well. So you get a wide variety of theories about what material objects are, for instance. Like there are some views, that one of my favorite views is we're just four-dimensional. If you think about space-time as four-dimensional, then we're just concatenations of particles that are, passing through four-dimensional space-time, right? And there's nothing else to us. There's another view that three-dimensionalist that says that the organisms are the only complex things that exist. And what's part of an organism? Well, there's no hard boundary to your body, right? Organisms have a shape that's kind of like a storm, and so they have at their core they have life, but then everything that gets caught up into them, like you think about like a hurricane. What's part of a hurricane? Well, it's this droplet of water that gets caught up into it and then spat out, and then it's no longer part of the hurricane, right? And so if we're like that. Those are two wildly different and yet conceptions of what a person is, and then also, or any material object. That the second view implies that there's no such thing as this table, for instance, because it's a non-organism complex object, and that view eliminative materialism says there are no non-organism complex objects, and so those philosophical views, they're both very different from each other, but also very different from anything that seems intuitive to us. But ultimately, the best we can do to defend them is if they make sense of the commitments that we have and can be defended in terms of the best modes of argumentation that we have.
Testable predictions, empirical reinforcement.
Yeah. It's a sort of a paradox of all of these sciences whose subject matter is the invisible, or the non-intuitive.
You mentioned convergence earlier, and the phenomenon of the more people talk about something they started out agreeing on, they're more likely to diverge, and that's a good thing. Conversely, is convergence after that point a sign that something's gone wrong, right? I mean, can you conclude that from that way of thinking, or
that's interesting?
Is it a red flag, so to speak? It's like, these two guys have been hammering out the same issue they've agreed on for 4 years, and no one's made any progress. It's probably a good sign that something's not being sincerely considered, right? Or critically examined.
That's a really interesting question. I guess I wouldn't say that as a general rule. Like I would hope, I mean, one of the reasons to go into philosophy is that you hope that if you try to get to the heart of a question, you can convince some people, or be convinced by them. And that involves sort of going from divergence to convergence. Mm-hmm. But convergence isn't, I guess I would say that neither convergence nor divergence is a static state, maybe is the way to put it, is a state. Mm-hmm. That we should expect them to be, converging and diverging over time. And one of the reasons that sort of that a shared politics is possible is because even if we diverge on really important fundamental questions of like what a human being is or what rights people have and so on, we can converge on certain policy options. Even if we converge on certain policy options, we may then diverge about how to develop them after that. Mm-hmm. So you can get shifting coalitions. One of the problems, I think, with our politics now is that instead of shifting coalitions, we get tribes. And tribalism,
yeah.
Yeah. And tribalism is dangerous because it makes it impossible to have a conversation where you're saying, okay, even if we can't agree on like fundamental questions A, B, and C, we can come up with a policy that will work for everybody, right? And if the main goal of Tribe A is to make sure that Tribe B, right, Mitch McConnell is the poster child of this because of what he said at the beginning of the Obama administration.
Make him a one-term president,
right? Yeah. And the strategy to ensure that they oppose everything he does, even if they agree with it, right? That's a tribalism that is corrosive of the very possibility of a politics that we do together.
Can I play devil's advocate with that issue?
Sure.
I'm not personally advocating this. I'm blaming it on the devil
for
intellectual curiosity. But is there an argument that politics is a game and there's strategies and there's good strategies and there's bad strategies and there's winners and there's losers? And from that position, is it a stretch to think that the people who voted for, say, Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump put them in office to do that very thing because they feel that their list of issues, their policies that they advocate for are right, and by virtue of that fact, the other side is wrong? Is there are you sympathetic to that at all? That one thing I admire about I don't admire, I respect what Trump did is he mastered the game of politics very quickly. I mean, when he came down the escalator with Melania, we're talking August 2014 or something like that.
Maybe later.
Yeah, and gave that press conference. They're sending their rapists here and their killers and all this stuff. Everybody that I saw on both sides said, "Oh, this guy is a clown. He's not serious. This is at best a trial run for his latest reality TV show."
Right.
And the man went and systematically destroyed 18 other entrenched career politicians and lobbyists and attorneys and business leaders to win that nomination, and then to beat Hillary Clinton, whose presidency was supposed to be ordained 8 years prior when she lost to Obama, right? I consider myself, I try to be open-minded, and even though I don't care for him personally, I respect the game. And he played the game masterfully, right? And he won. Can you comment on that? Is there an argument for that, or is that too distasteful for you?
No, I think it's important to think about what we mean by a game. So I think and I'm not 100% sure which way you mean it. When you first said it, I thought you meant it in one way, and that is this: when people say that politics is a game, or it's all just a game, or something, the idea is that people are pawns, and there's some game being played at a high level, and we're the playthings. And I think that vision, and I actually, in that sense, right, where a game it's like an attempt for people to get their own benefit, and they'll use anybody else to do so.
And we're assuming it's a zero-sum game environment too, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And so I think when people say it's all just a game, with that meaning, I sometimes worry that politics is all just a game in that meaning, and that would be a bad thing. In my view, and I do some work in the philosophy of games, and I'm a big fan of games. But the important thing about a game is that nobody plays involuntarily, right? So a game, you're only playing a game if you're voluntarily playing it, and you are aiming at the goal so that you can have the activity for its own sake, right? That's what makes something a game. You sort of choose a goal, and you accept rules in the pursuit of that goal, so that you can enjoy the activity in the interim.
And we all play by the rules.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's a respect for the game itself.
That's right. But crucially, all the people are players and not playthings, not pawns.
That's an important distinction.
Yeah, so I think that in if you think about politics as a game in that sense, what I would prefer to say is that we might even think about justice as a game. If you think about it, is establishing a set of procedures that we can follow to achieve justice, and we're playing cooperatively with others. Now, within cooperation, there can be competition. So my favorite example is when you get together with some people to play basketball for an afternoon. You don't play one game of basketball for 3 hours, right? You choose up teams, you play a game to 11. If one team was way better than the other, you shift the teams around, right? Why? Because the competition enables you to have fun.
When you're rebalancing the field too, right?
That's right. It's within a cooperative structure.
Yeah.
And so I think if we think of politics as it's competitive, and you do what you can to win, provided that every person is a player and not a plaything.
And playing by the rules.
And playing by the rules.
Respecting the spirit of the game.
Exactly. And I don't think that in politics you wouldn't expect let's change up the side so that the other side can win sometimes. The mechanism for that, though, is that the other side has a way of poaching your players, and that is by poaching your ideas. And so the way democracy should work is as a game in that sense, so that if the Democrats are out of power, the best thing they can do to gain power is they can show, as it were, they can poach some of the players from the Republican side by saying, here, you'll actually succeed better if you do A, B, and C than you will if you do what they want you to do. And the people say, oh, so I will. Yeah. Right. And that's an effective game of politics.
As opposed to gerrymandering and redistricting and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, right. If the elite gets to choose their voters versus the voters getting to choose their elites, it's exactly the opposite.
I'm so glad you made that point, because the way I described it sounded kind of like I was on the sidelines just kind of watching the show, and you added some real substance to that. And what came to mind when you said that was, there's too much on the line for this just to be a game.
Right.
Yeah. There's too many people that are disproportionately impacted by these policy changes. There's too many decent people who are humble and honest, and all they want is an opportunity to go to work, do honest work, and come home and take care of their families and send their kid to a decent school and pay their mortgage. Basic stuff, right? There's too much on the line to just gamify it and just observe it from the sidelines, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Certainly, if we think about the game in that first sense, where those people are playthings, right? And if their loyalties are to be toyed with, then we're lost. I think democracy is impossible with that model, where it's sort of the advertising model, where what's that line? If you aren't a paying customer, you're the product, right?
Oh, okay. I like that.
Yeah, it's for apps. I try to remember that.
Because they're harvesting all your demographic information, all your private.
Yeah. And so and that kind of inversion becomes possible in power, especially in power relationships and so on, where the kind of person that you're describing, who just wants to be able to live their life, they don't have the time or energy or knowledge to keep full track of what a bureaucracy is doing, or even what the elected officials are doing from one thing to the next. So it's essential that we safeguard against that kind of inversion of the power relationship that makes the everyday person the plaything. The everyday person needs to be one of the players, even if they're not, as it were, the team captain or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. People need to have skin in the game.
Yeah.
I remember one thing. I know we're picking on Trump here, but there's so much material there. I can't resist. His going back to I think a year before his reelection date, spreading all this paranoia about election tampering and fraud. I heard someone really insightful comment on that. He made a great point. He said, in a democracy where there's some basic understanding that the process is relatively clean, to go around and sow the seeds of election tampering and fraud and all that is very dangerous, extremely dangerous. And I think it gives you some insight into his mindset. That doesn't matter to him.
Right.
What matters to him is, I personally believe that man has no political philosophy at all. If you go back and look at his comments prior to running as a Republican, you could add them all up, make a case that he's a moderate Democrat or a liberal, right? I think that he saw a path to becoming president, and that was the last notch on his belt after dating all these supermodels and building all these businesses and conquering TV and all this stuff, right? I saw that was the last thing for him to do. And I am convinced that if he saw a path to getting to the White House, being a Democrat, he would have done it. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. I think that I guess I would say I don't think he cared about the party, and we would have all been better off if the Republican Party had been a stronger party, right? So there's a political theorist, Jacob Levy at McGill, who makes this distinction: strong partisanship, weak parties. And one of the things that parties do is they have a longer lifespan than any official who's elected under them, and so the party has an interest in making sure that what it does now is still going to be palatable in 10 years. Mm-hmm. It has an interest in not cheating to win this election because it knows that the other party will cheat worse to win the next election. Mm-hmm. So they keep the what's the word?
It's a built-in incentive to keep the integrity of the process intact, the legacy of the party.
That's right. And because parties have become so weak, and the Republican Party in particular has become so weak.
Yeah, we'll take anybody that could win.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? So they were unable to coalesce against Trump. Yeah. And if you look at, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know exactly if this is parallel, but Bernie Sanders was an independent, running as an independent, or has always been an independent, and ran for the Democratic nomination. Mm-hmm. And it had a lot of ideas that, love him or hate him, were toxic to the Democratic Party elite. Mm-hmm. The Democrats are still it's a weakening party, but it's not as weak as the Republicans, and so they were able to coalesce to prevent Bernie from winning.
Yeah, twice, right? Hillary and Biden, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, and the Republicans couldn't do that with somebody who was a much more serious threat to their own establishment than Bernie was to the Democratic establishment. Yeah. And so I don't know if Trump could equally well have come up as a Democrat, but I think you're right that he didn't care per se about the party. He cared about himself.
Yeah, I wasn't arguing that he would win as a Democrat, but I was arguing that he would take that path if he saw that being the most likely path to getting what he wants. Yeah, I appreciate you mentioned that, Bernie. There's lots of things to like and dislike about Bernie, but I respect that guy because he's authentic. I am what does he call himself? A revolutionary socialist? Yeah. I mean, why would you lie about that, right? I mean,
I think he calls himself a democratic socialist, but he wants a political revolution.
There you go.
But there's so much fractionalism on that that revolutionary socialist, I think those are Trotskyists or something like that.
That could mean a lot of different things,
that's right? Exactly, that's right.
What's your flavor of socialistic totalitarianism? Are you more of a Leninist, a Stalinist, a Nazi? A friend of mine made a really eloquent observation. We were talking about Trump and his appeal and how he convinced, love or hate the guy, he convinced 70 plus million people to vote for him. These are people that like to lecture us on morality and values, and they vote for a guy who arguably doesn't have a moral, compass out of his inner circle and himself. But he made a really interesting point. I want to get your comment on this. He's a conservative, by the way, a moderate conservative. He said that Republicans in general, and that side of the middle class that's moderate and could swing one way or the other, got so tired of being told that they're racist and they're sexist and they're homophobic and they're xenophobic and all this stuff that they know they're not, but the culture has evolved to a point, and it's influenced by the left, where that's really pervasive. He said at that point, those people said, look, they could have trotted anybody out there as long as he said a few buzzwords that were anti-woke, right? That they would have voted for anyone. And it reminded me, another friend told me about a book called Jesus and John Wayne. Have you heard of that?
Mm-mm.
Oh, yeah. He said that the Republican Party in the last 30 years has gone from the party of Ronald Reagan calling America the shining city on the hill to moving away from these Jesus Christian-based characters, inspired characters, to more towards Trump, this shoot from the hip Texas style. You know, it was really interesting. I'd love to read the book sometime. Can you comment on that? Because I personally, important point I want to make for the audience here is I deliberately every day expose myself to what the left is saying, to what the right is saying, to what the internet's saying. I want to get a diverse collection of perspectives and insights, and I can form my own opinion. There's a lot of people on the right that I respected, people like Dennis Prager and Michael Medved, serious thinkers. I don't agree with a lot of what they say in their policies, but I find them to be well thought out, sincere people, decent people I just happen to disagree with. These people have, by and large, jumped on board with Trump just because he's the hot political potato right now. I've lost a lot of respect for them, man. I mean, you don't have to be Pope, in my eyes, to get to be president, but there has to be a baseline of decency, right? Doesn't that matter? To these people, it doesn't. And then the irony is they lecture us on what's right and wrong. You know, can you comment on that?
There was a lot there.
Sorry, unpack it and comment on what you'd like to. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would avoid. I think it's important not to overanalyze Trump's win in 2016. I mean, first of all, because he lost the popular vote, but secondly, because after two terms of one party, it's almost always the case. It's very rare to get a third term of the same party.
I say that all the time.
So
statistically, it was so likely.
Yeah, right. And the Hillary Clinton, for right or wrong reasons, Hillary Clinton's negatives were so high that generic Republicans should have won after two terms of Democrats against Hillary Clinton. And so the fact that Trump lost the popular vote is a striking sign that he's never been all that popular, right? And his approval rating never got very high either. I don't think it even hit 50% once while he was president. So I think it's important not to overanalyze like his victory as you know. By the same token, it's important not to assume that anyone who wins is ever sort of the people's choice, right? So I think one big mistake that Democrats made in 2008 was thinking that there was a new consensus and that it was expressed in Barack Obama. And there wasn't ever a new consensus. And an electoral college win is, even an electoral college landslide, is not unanimity by a long shot. And so it's really important not to overanalyze either wins of either side, I think. As for who gets, I don't know. I mean, you'd hope. I mean, you'd think that something that you could see that the way somebody treats other people should be an indicator of how they're going to treat the people. And I think that at least that far, you want somebody in office who clearly treats people the right way and knows how people ought to be treated. So in that sense, I certainly agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. We could talk about this and many other topics forever. In the interest of keeping this palatable time-wise for our audience, we're going to shift to another segment of our show here. I want to spend a few minutes with you talking about the philosophy department of U of L. I'm a big advocate for higher education. I'm so grateful for the education that I got from the University of Louisville in general and the philosophy department specifically. Can you take a few minutes to bring the audience up to speed on what philosophy is doing now? I know you guys are involved in the community. Just advocate for the philosophy department. Tell people why it'd be good to take a course or two and consider majoring. Do that if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting, up until about 50 years ago, most college students, when they were asked what they wanted out of college, they said they wanted to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. And humanities courses, philosophy courses were extremely in demand. In the last 50 years, that's really changed. And there are a number of drivers of that, and some of them are more easily understood and some are less easily understood. But I think that whatever else is the case, whatever the drivers are, that's less viewed as something either that you can get in college or that you would want to get in college, either because you think you can get it elsewhere or should get it elsewhere, or that you can't get it in college, and so there's no point going to college for it. And instead, people tend to have a much more careerist or transactional relationship to college, and that's understandable. And so what has philosophy done in the intervening 50 years? Well, in our department, we've shifted over the course of that time. I think there used to be a much more decided focus on the history of philosophy, which is really important. The people that I've mentioned, like Aristotle, it's really important to understand what they said and why and what the arguments were and so on. But more on contemporary problems of philosophy, and ethics is a big one. So we have a real strength in healthcare ethics now. We've just hired a clinical ethicist who will be arriving this summer. We have I guess 3 or 4 of us teach in the healthcare ethics MA program. And we also have, at the undergraduate level, we have an ethics certificate that we offer to students who, they might not want to major in philosophy, but they want 4 courses in ethics where they can get a pretty rigorous training in ethical theory, ethics in practice, ethics within their profession. And then when they go out, employers know this is something that I can count on from this person. They will have thought about this stuff. They will have a certain amount of training and practice in thinking about hard problems. And so if you're an employer and you're like, well, should I do X or Y? There might be an ethical aspect to that other than just the money-making aspect to it. And you might want somebody who has practice with that. So we offer those ethics-specific specializations. But also we have faculty in philosophy who are really closely aligned with psychology, both the psychology of emotions, psychology of linguistics, language development, and so on. There are important issues in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind about how we develop language and what how language is even possible, how communication is possible, that kind of thing, and the role of emotions in rationality. Those are really important areas that are maybe it's not like seeing the direct how am I going to get a job in the relationship between emotions and rationality. But understanding people in that way can be a really important driver of entrepreneurship or of success in the job market and so on. So philosophy has become more focused on problems that I think are practical in their nature. And even aesthetics. So one thing that we got a small grant to do to work with the theater arts department to put on a production of Plato's Symposium. And even though Plato's Symposium, that's the history of philosophy, it's 2,500 years ago now. It's a meditation on what it is to live a good life, what love is, and what goodness is. And so we got a theater arts faculty member to work with students, and a philosophy faculty member, John Gibson, whom I think you know, who does aesthetics, working with those same students together to produce an online. It had to be online because of the pandemic a production of Plato's Symposium, which you can still see on the U of L Theater Arts YouTube page.
Kind of a cross-discipline collaboration.
Cool. And theater is, of course, in Louisville in particular, theater is a real. It's an important industry, and having theater professionals who've been able to think through these kinds of questions and how to bring philosophical ideas onto the stage, I think is really valuable.
Well, like I said, I'm a huge advocate for just learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I always want to expose myself to lots of different perspectives and worldviews and thoughts and information. I recommend anybody that's taking the higher education route in college, take a philosophy course. It's usually a prerequisite on the core, regardless of what you're majoring in. My own anecdotal advice from that is don't make your only interaction with a philosophy course logic. Logic is great. I love logic. I enjoyed it. It's math with words. It's really interesting. But take something a little more nuanced. Take ancient philosophy or cognitive philosophy or political ethics, whatever it might be, right? I think you'll really, if you don't have to go on to major or minor in philosophy, but I think you'll get a better taste of the role that philosophy plays in the world than just taking a logic course. And when I was at U of L 20 plus years ago, it seemed like, oh yeah, you need a philosophy course, take logic. I hope that's changed from the advisors.
Yeah. Now we have the sort of the cardinal core curriculum. So if somebody's just looking for a core curriculum class, logic might be a class that they'll take, but it's equally likely they'll take a contemporary ethical problems course or whatever. And I mean, if I can just piggyback on what you said, it's the rare person who is going to finish a degree in philosophy and go on to graduate school in philosophy. And much more likely is, well, many people go on to law school or some other professional school, and philosophy is excellent training for that. But what we're hearing these days from employers is that they want people who have these career skills that are not the particular skill you're going to. I mean, the employer will train you in the particular, software application or the particular method of their particular office,
right,
or their particular workplace. But what they want, and what employers 20 and 30 years out will want over a career where you might change jobs 5 times, is these sort of career skills like critical thinking, writing, being able to read and digest information, being able to see multiple sides of a problem. And those are the skills that you get in philosophy, but also in the humanities more generally. And logic helps with that. Critical thinking classes help with that. Ethics classes, they help with that. And it's not just for ethical problems, it's for all sorts of problems. And so, and I think so that's my sort of propaganda pitch. Yeah. Philosophy is, as it were, the career skill par excellence, no matter what you're going into. So.
I agree. I noticed I wasn't the greatest student when I got to college, but once I started majoring in philosophy and taking philosophy courses, I noticed that I became a better student in the other courses. Huh. I did better. I got better grades. I was more enthusiastic. It was really a lovely experience. Yeah. That's wonderful. So I highly recommend you guys check out the University of Louisville and their philosophy department. Do you want to give a plug to the website or any social media places where people can interact with the department?
Oh yeah. So golly, I should have had them written down, but we're on Facebook and we're on Twitter. Okay. I think our students have an Instagram, but I don't know how often that's updated because I'm too old to be on Instagram.
Yeah.
But it's I think it's Louisville Philosophy. I don't even remember.
Yeah, probably type in U of L Philosophy. It'll come up something like that.
Yes, that's right.
Those savvy youngsters will.
Yes.
Find a way to find you on social media.
Yeah,
that's great. And then is it louisville.edu / philosophy, I guess?
Yes, exactly. That's right. Okay. Yeah.
Great. I wanted to segue to our next topic, and that's See Good to Be Good, which is a nonprofit that my wife and I started basically to help people see examples of people doing good and being good.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So you can interact with us at seegoodtobegood.org. We'd be glad to take donations. If you give a donation, every expense of running See Good to Be Good comes out of mine and my wife's pocket. So if you donated $10, all $10 would go to the cause. And right now the cause is a needs-based academic scholarship for someone to help pay for their higher education.
Fantastic.
And I'll have more details about that down the road. But we're also looking for people who want to contribute their time and their resources. So if anyone listens, want to give back to their community and provide an example of how they've been successful or what are their keys to getting educated, having professional success, personal success, please contact us and interact with us. I like to ask my guests a few questions. So here we go. Question number 1, why are you successful?
I mean, a lot of good luck. and maybe that's it.
Yeah, that's a fair answer.
I mean, I guess I think I work hard, but lots of people work harder than me, and don't succeed. And so, good fortune is a driver of so much. And that's one reason that I think what you said earlier resonates so much with me. Like, every kid needs to have an equal chance to realize their potential.
We're all in this together. Those children now will be the president eventually, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so hopefully they'll take care of us when we're old and shriveled up.
That's right. Be nice to your kids. They'll choose your nursing home.
There you go. Yeah. I think you and I are kindred spirits in many ways. You're the first person to answer that question the exact same way I would answer it. I've made some good decisions. I've done some good things in my life. I've been disciplined and followed some wise life practices and so forth, but the vast majority of it for me is luck, man. So many people that have entered my life randomly and taken an interest in my life and helped me. You mentioned earlier, there's people that work harder than you are nowhere as successful as you. I feel the same way. There's a plumber out there working 80 hours a week right now, cleaning up, God knows what's in someone's toilet and barely getting by, right? Why do I deserve the life that I have? I don't. It's gratitude, I came to a place, I think about 15 years ago, where I had a life-changing moment where all of a sudden it occurred to me that I was taking myself way too seriously, and I realized in that moment that I am nothing. Like, if I died tomorrow, some people would cry and they'd miss me and so forth and whatever, but life would go on. And in the cosmic sense, I'm an microscopic fraction of a grain of sand when compared to the number of people that have come before me, the people that will hopefully come after me, the size of the universe, everything, right?
Yeah.
And from that moment, I gained perspective and purpose and meaning. And I've been on a next level of happiness and success ever since. It's hard to explain to people, but I think you understand from realizing that you're nothing. Everything comes from that, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some philosophers who would agree with that too, right? And some philosophical ways of thinking. It's so interesting to hear you answer that the same way I would. My next question for you is, why are you happy?
I think we are kindred spirits. Yeah. Again, there's a lot of luck in happiness too, I must say. But can I jump again?
Please.
Piggyback on what you said.
Please elaborate.
So one of the reasons I got interested in the philosophy of games is because, heavily influenced by this Canadian philosopher named Bernard Suits, who wrote a book called The Grasshopper: Games, Life, and Utopia, which I recommend to everybody if I can. And I think I used to use it in Intro to Philosophy, but the students never liked it as much as I did, and I was always so disappointed about that.
You could take the heartbreak
That's right.
of their disinterest.
That's right. But one of the things that that makes games so interesting is if you think about our life, as you say, right? Nothing in the end. We're not only in the end of our own lives, we're all dead, but the universe itself, everything we could possibly care about, will be destroyed.
Yeah.
And so the living has to be the value. And you set goals in the living. As I said before, when talking about politics as a game, you set goals in the living, not because the goals per se matter more than anything else or matter so much, but because by setting the goal and accepting constraints on how you pursue that goal, you make the activity of the living valuable in its own sake,
worthwhile.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of it. Like I agree. The value has to be in the living, because it's not going to be in something we get when we're done. You know.
Yeah. The sun's going to supernova in a couple billion years.
That's right.
Yeah. What did you do before that? Yeah.
Right.
I think Einstein said, I'm paraphrasing here, stop praying to God for a miracle. Your whole life is a miracle.
Here.
The fact that you exist, right? I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Final question for you. To the extent that you're successful and happy, what obligation do you feel to help other people, who might not have reached the same level of success or happiness that you have? What obligation do you feel to help those folks? Well,
I guess I would say it comes back to the question of like why I'm successful. Like I think that one of the things that as you grow up and mature, right, you come to realize that or at least I did. My parents were both educated. I grew up in a Canada.
Groomed.
I was groomed. Yes, no, let's not use that word. I grew up in Canada, a country where there was
Tempered.
universal free healthcare and universal free public education. I was white. I am white.
Yeah, it's nice to be a white male, right?
And in Canada at the time, even better.
Yeah.
I'm Jewish, but the immigration laws in Canada had liberalized just enough for my family.
Oh.
Soon before that, right? If my family had been trying to come to Canada in 1939,
not so
we'd all
much.
be dead, right? So
Did they immigrate from Europe?
not directly. They actually immigrated from the U.S. My
Okay.
family, but my dad's parents had immigrated in 1918, just before immigration laws closed down. So just the sheer luck of that. But those institutions, that's not just luck. It was also injustice. Seeing how the ways that unjust institutions have favored me makes it really important to me that I not sort of continue taking advantage of unjust institutions in ways that keep other people down. There's nothing I can do about the fact that I grew up a white male in Canada,
But you can not participate.
Right.
Exploit that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And try to change the rules and the system so that those injustices don't keep on stepping on people. And so that's for me, that's like a real driving force. And I'm deeply imperfect at it. Right. The sad thing is anyone who is a white male of a certain class and participates in the society that we have, there's the injustice comes at you in your favor in so many ways.
It's good to be king.
It is, right. That's right. And that does create an obligation to work against the injustices.
Yeah. So. I love that. It's funny. I didn't know you were Jewish. My wife is from a family of Jewish immigrants from Belarus.
Oh, wow.
They made it here, not speaking any English at the age of 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
In what year?
She would have been 1990, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, they won the lottery, so to speak, and were sponsored by the Jewish Federation here in Louisville. Coincidentally, moved to an apartment complex about a half a mile down the road from the same road I grew up on.
Wow.
Old 6 Mile Lane here in Louisville, or J-Town. And we never knew each other until we met 5 or 6 years ago.
That's
and
funny. Got
married. And no, you're not allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it because I'm that kind of guy. Jews are disproportionately educated, successful, interesting, creative. You know what I'm saying? You're not allowed to say it, but I like what Jerry Seinfeld said. If you're saying something nice about the race, it's not racist. Okay? And I'm proud that my son is Jewish. I'm proud of that. His middle name is Albert after Albert Einstein, my hero, the greatest scientist of all time, and a Jewish fellow too. So you mentioned something earlier about the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis and so forth. That stuff really resonates with me because we're a Jewish family. We have a mezuzah on the door and we observe Passover and all that. And I personally am not Jewish. But I'm so happy that my son is in that exclusive group of people. If you meet a Jewish person, there's a really good chance they're disproportionately successful, educated, interesting, creative, just great people, So, yeah.
I have no comment.
Proof's in the pudding right there. So that's great. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that this is Professor Avery Kolers. He is you don't say chairman, you just say chair, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the
mostly
chair.
Because I get sat on.
Okay, there you go. That's the role. The chair of the philosophy department at the University of Louisville. I highly suggest you interact with those folks. And I think one course, even if you audit it as an adult, could change your life, right?
Here.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. It's a true honor to have you. I have all these notes here on things I wanted to talk about with you, but we ran out of time. Maybe you could come back sometime.
Sure.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Great.
Thanks.
Great. If you would like to be a guest on our show or you would like help creating and or distributing your own podcast, please contact us for more information. I'd like to thank our sponsors for making this podcast possible and hopefully successful. And we will see you real soon on a future episode of the Respect the Math podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here.